Hello and welcome to this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch, brought to you by the Baker Street Irregulars. I'm Steve Doyle and I'm your host. This episode kicks off our second season of the Fortnightly Dispatch. We had quite a long layoff from November to now over the holidays and the BSI weekend and lots of other shellacking activities, but it's time to get back in the groove here. So here we are. I'm very happy to have our guest with us today. Our guest today is Steve Rothman. Steve is probably best known in the shellackian community as the editor of the Baker Street Journal. Steve has been doing the journal for a long time, and we'll talk to him briefly about that. But Steve is also the editor of a number of books. One of them is this one. Let me see if I can do this without reflecting too badly. A Remarkable Mixture. It's a selection of the award-winning, Morley Montgomery award-winning essays from the Baker Street Journal. This book is fantastic, and you should get a copy of it. It was published by the Baker Street Irregulars. But more pertinent to our conversation today is this book. It's called The Standard Doyle Company. It's Christopher Morley on Sherlock Holmes, because Steve Rothman edited this book, and today's topic of conversation is none other than Christopher Morley. Steve is one of the foremost experts on Christopher Morley. And as you know, Christopher Morley is sort of the ground zero for the shellacking hobby. And it's time that we had a conversation about him. So without any further ado, Steve, welcome to the show. I'm so glad that you're here today with us.
I'm delighted to be here, Steve. It's been fun watching all of these, and I'm pleased to be part of them.
Well, I'm glad you're here. So as I mentioned in the introduction, you wear a number of hats, like we all do. You are the editor of the Baker Street Journal. This is the latest issue.
And you are the publisher.
And I'm the publisher, so yes, I'm well acquainted with the quality of your work. And you've been doing, now tell me how long you've been publisher of the journal.
I started doing it in 2000, so I am now in my 22nd year on the job.
That's amazing. It really, truly is. I mean, did you ever think you'd be doing it this long?
Did I ever think I'd be doing it? Period. No, I never thought I would. I never thought I would be editor of the Baker Street Journal. When I was a little boy and first subscribed, such a long time, I'm not even going to tell you because it will embarrass everyone, that I never thought that I would be one of the grown-ups, even contributing to the journal, let alone, editing it. And no, when I said yes to Mike Whalen in the spring of '99, I never thought that I would be doing this for this long. But I've been having fun, and nobody has complained too loudly, I guess, and so I'm still here.
It is fun to work on it. I agree. I mean, I don't do what you do, but it is a job that, I've been doing it 10 years. I can't believe that. It is a job that I think everybody who has anything to do with it takes a lot of pride in the it's always still a thrill when it shows up in the mailbox, right?
There is, even in my mailbox.
I know, right? And nowadays it's a thrill that it shows up at all, the way the mail is. Well, anyway, let's not talk about that. But I didn't bring you here to talk about the journal today. I asked you to join the show because one of the goals of this program is to introduce. We have so many newer shellackings who've come in over the last decade or so, and one of the goals is to sort of offer a way to learn about significant shellacking figures, characters, books, events that it can be kind of hard to learn about. And so today I think I brought you in because I'd like to talk about the founder of our feast, Christopher Morley, and I know that you are one of the foremost experts on Morley, and that's why I wanted to talk to you today. So who was Christopher Morley?
Short answer. Christopher Morley was a prolific novelist, journalist, poet, playwright, cultural figure. He was an important part of our country's cultural scene from almost 1918 till he died almost 40 years later. And in most of that time, he was everywhere. Everyone would have known him. He would have been, what we call today a bold-faced name. He would have been in the newspapers all the time, whether it was something that he wrote that was syndicated, whether it was in some gossip column, whether it was a new book being reviewed, because books were coming out all the time. It was on the radio. He was producing
on television
plays,
too.
writing plays. He was there. You knew who Christopher Morley was, whether you were a reader or not, and he was just part of the scene.
So that's really interesting. So, we as Sherlockians, we have an understanding that he started the Baker Street Irregulars, and we'll get to that. But it was way more than that, and I find it really interesting when we're looking at the very earliest Sherlockians, how accomplished they were as people, and certainly that's him, right?
He was a 1910 graduate of Haverford College, as Bob Katz never stops to remind us. He was a Rhodes Scholar going off. He and his two brothers were all Rhodes Scholars. I think they are still the only three members of a family of siblings to be Rhodes Scholars, even today, 100 years later. And he was a Rhodes Scholar. His first jobs out were working for Doubledays as a publisher. He was everywhere. He really was. He was somebody that was writing, thinking, pushing books, not only his books, but other books. He was a reviewer, so he was an important guy that you wanted to attract the attention of. He was one of the original editors of the Saturday Review of Literature. He was on the book section of the old New York Post, not to be confused with the Murdoch Post, except by name. And
that's so interesting. And it was all that, and he was a Sherlockian, indeed. Even as a boy, right? Even in childhood.
Even as a boy, he talks about his parents were both from England. His father was a mathematics professor, first at Haverford College and then at Johns Hopkins for most of his career. And his mother was also English. And they, in fact, never became American citizens, that they lived all their life from the late 1880s on here. But they had the Strand magazine coming in, so then they were readers, and so he talks about reading all this stuff. And when his parents' house, from the library at Haverford College, where fiction was not really in favor at that time, with this little Quaker college, and so it was sort of hidden away. But the librarian, who was a friend of his parents, because there was a faculty of probably 15, it's a very small school, said to the boy, "Here, read these books," and he did, and yes, and then he tells this wonderful story about after his parents moved to Baltimore, and he's reading the books at the Pratt Free Library, and he would take books out, and he would look for Conan Doyle, especially, not so much the Sherlock Holmes, because I'm not even sure if really they had any of those, but the other novels and things like this. And he would read them as he's walking home, which was a mile and a half. Trudge. We all remember reading as a child, walking along. And well, we could still do this.
Sure.
And maybe you still do. And
well, sometimes
and he would get home. He'd get home. He'd read the book already, and was a sort of a disappointment. He talks about taking his brothers, who were a good bit younger than he, and his father wrote exam papers. He would write exam papers. They'd have to read the Sherlock Holmes stories, and then he would test them rigorously on them. They said they really had to read them.
Now, about that, isn't it true? And he's got an autobiographical novel, but isn't it true that he technically created the first Sherlock Holmes club or society with his brothers in childhood? I mean, didn't they have a name?
He had this group that they called the Sign of the Four, or TSO4, and it was him and some friends. And he talks about it a little bit. And after a lot of research, I did identify all of them, and I don't have the list right here, so you're out of luck. But it wasn't an easy thing to do, because he just sort of says a classics professor, this one, of that one, but between letters and things like this, able to figure it all out. And so they had this group, and they all had investitures, as it were. One was Sherlock Holmes, I think. One who wasn't there when they started was Mrs. Hudson, and so one was Moriarty, and
it's amazing, and you see those seeds of those, the seeds of the universe that we all live in, were already germinating in his childhood. And I think that's people don't think about that often. We talk a lot about how he was a club former, and this just happened to be one that got traction. But when I heard about this, I thought, no, this seemed a little more destined to have something because of that childhood.
Oh, absolutely. I've got a diary from his last year at Haverford, his first year at Oxford, and he lists the books that are in his room. And among them, there are a couple books by Doyle, including, I think, The Adventures or The Return, and something like that. And so he was there. He was reading these books and owning these books. And because his list of books wasn't that many, it was an undergraduate's list of books that were his copies. So
yeah,
and he also, as a boy, was given a rubber stamp kit for Christmas one year and stamped all the books in the house, CDMPL, Christopher D. Darlington Morley Public Library. And number one, which is at Haverford College, is a copy of Conan Doyle's, I'm going to say, I think it's the Carrasco, but it might be the Green Flag. I think it's the Green Flag. So an American edition of the Green Flag. So there you are. He was reading these books from as a kid. They made a real effect on him, and he's always talking about, loving all of Doyle as just being a kind of perfect anodyne to the worries of the world. And when you live through World War I, Depression, and World War II, you had a lot of worries. We understand that today.
A little better anymore, yeah. Isn't that interesting? I really appreciate that, and it speaks to me personally because, as someone who has everything I ever loved as a kid, I still do. So, to know that, to see somebody else who I admire so much have the same, instinct, is good for me. Okay, it's not just me. That's good. That's good. So let's talk a little bit about let's kind of start to pivot toward the BSI. So we've all sort of heard the thumbnail sketch about he formed clubs and let's talk about that. I mean, he did do this, didn't he? I mean, he did
form clubs. He formed lots of clubs. There was this one. And when he was an undergraduate, he had a club with another friend that they called the Maltworms. It was just the two of them, and I think it was just drinking, but and smoking pipes and pretending you're big shots, because they didn't write much about it to each other since they were talking to each other about it. So I can only tell you a little bit about it. Then when he was a young publisher at Doubledays, with others, formed what they called the Small Fry, which was a young publishers sort of club. Wow. And they would have meetings and drink and talk and complain and think about the future of literature. And indeed, that's the story that they tell. One time they're at a bar and there's guy comes over to him and says, "What are you boys talking about? The death of literature? Them's fighting words, mister." And so it went, and then he formed what he called the 3 Hours for Lunch Club. It was the 20s. Everybody had the job. They would go off. They would go somewhere exciting: Hoboken, Brooklyn, Philadelphia. Strangely, and they would have their long outings. They would drink. They would eat. They would talk. They would drink and eat and talk more. And they would invite pals along. Sea captains were favorites, booksellers, prize fighters, whoever. And
wow,
a guy's sort of club of, and rich guys too, to help pay for it or defer or have them in their private car on the railroad or something like this. Always handy to know a rich guy. And at one point, they actually bought a ship.
What? I didn't know this.
They bought a three-mast ship called the Tusitala, they named it, which is after what the Samoans called Robert Louis Stevenson.
Right.
And so they had this ship, and they thought this would be a money-making thing. This would be great. We could carry cargo. And then when we wanted to go on trips, that didn't work. And they ended up having to sell it to one of their richer members or something like this. And then in the late 20s, he and some other friends rented a theater in Hoboken, New Jersey, where they started to resurrect melodramas and other sort of things. And Morley would play with the scripts, and they issued it, and they would come. He wrote the ads in all the New York papers saying, "Sidle on over," Seidel, sidle on over to Hoboken, the last coast of Bohemia, he would call it. And people came from New York. All the fashionable, it became very fashionable, it became so successful, they rented another theater. And they redid After Dark, which was an old 1850s melodrama, and it had in it a sort of can lineup of girls. So it became a leg show, and people came over to see this, and it was very popular. And they were doing so well, they wanted to buy an old foundry where they were going to have a clubhouse and things like this. And 1929 comes along, and
party's over.
Party's over. There were other problems too, but party's over. Morley spent a good bit of the Depression paying back all the debts, which he felt in a way responsible for. They did their best to keep things going well into 1930, but they had to let them go. But you look at the names on the programs, you recognize some of them. Sterling Holloway, who did a lot of voiceovers for Disney. Agnes DeMille, her first professional jobs were doing the choreography for these shows. Wow. That's something. And
that is something.
Others. And so it was a big deal. It didn't work well. I mean, I think anybody with a real sense would have looked at it and said, you're taking on too much, and he was. But it was fun. So he did this, and then there's a quiet little period where I think he's staying away from all his clubs and busily, frantically writing. He had 4 kids.
Right. I mean, he was, this. If you didn't know any better, you would think that he was this sort of man about town but he was a family man. He lived in the suburbs, and he was,
he was very much a family man. He wasn't sticking around New York City after dark a whole lot himself. He was getting back on the train and going out to Roslyn, Long Island, where he lived in Roslyn Estates, which is a part of it. And there he was with his wife and his kids. And, all 4 kids were in private schools. He believed that they should all have educations, and they shouldn't be at the same school. So they were all at different schools. Wow. And then there's, and they're in college by 1934, I guess. As old as Frank Morley Jr. was in college by then. So there's a lot of money having to go out the door to pay tuitions.
So interesting. I remember the one year, a few years back. How long ago? How many years ago was it? 10 years, probably. Um, the BSI took the Sunday afternoon trip out um, to the cemetery and to lay some flowers on his grave and visit him, and also to go see the knothole. So tell us what the knothole is.
The knothole was a little shack that he built as his writing studio. It was in his backyard. It really was rough cut boards as the siding. It had a little porch in front, and it was just one room with bookshelves around the side and a cot, sort of like you might find on a ship, built into the side, and a desk. And that was it. And then after a few years, one of his good friends was Buckminster Fuller, and Bucky had designed what he called a Dymaxion bathroom, which is very like the sort of bathroom you might see in an airplane today, except it also had a bathtub, and it was all made out of copper. And so that took up part of the porch, and it was built out there, and I can't imagine it was very comfortable in the winter.
No, I doubt it.
There was also a little fireplace and a chimney in the knothole, so he could write there. And it was a place that friends would come by. They would go out in the back for a drink. He would amble there after dinner and write. He could, since he had 4 kids, he could get away from them, and it would be quieter and write. And in 1950, I'm going to say, they had been away for a month, 6 weeks or so in England visiting family and friends. He came back. Vandals had broken into the knothole, torn all the books off the shelf, all the papers out of their chests and things like this. And I've seen pictures that were done for insurance company. It was really knee-high papers and things like this. He had a heart attack on the spot, and really it was the end of his decent health. I think after that he had a stroke. It was not a pretty end.
Oh, that's terrible. Yeah, that's a sad ending to that story. Yeah. It was fun to see that place, though. You could really get a sense of who would have a place like that. They moved it, right? I mean, it's not.
No, it's not where it is. The county moved it to what they call Christopher Morley Park. And so it's there on Long Island, and it's opened, I think, by appointment now. I'm not sure if it has any sort of regular hours. And the books that were there and other books are in the public library in Roslyn. So they can be visited by appointment. They have a nice collection of Morley papers.
So let's take a break for a minute because we want to get a word in from our sponsor. Okay, we're back. So a lot of the Sherlockian stuff sort of started in the Saturday Review of Literature. Is that right?
That's right. He was putting in little paragraphs here and there. He was putting in essays about it. He was published, most of his early essays were in about Sherlock Holmes were there. Was Sherlock Holmes an American? And things like this were all published in his column, which was called The Bowling Green, because when he had been writing for the New York Post Saturday literary supplement, it was called The Bowling Green because the Post was located right on the Bowling Green in New York City. So he would write about it there. He also was conducting another column in the Saturday Review of Literature that was called The Trade Winds. Pun on, it was mostly about publishing, but that would also have little items about Sherlock Holmes. And so it grew more and more, and the readers responded to this stuff wonderfully. They really liked it. And back and forth and back and forth. And finally comes 1930. Conan Doyle dies. Doubledays comes to him where he still had lots of friends
Mhm.
and said, Chris, we want to put out a complete Sherlock Holmes. Since we know there's not going to be any more stories now, wouldn't
Now
you
that we
like
know
to
this is
write
it.
wouldn't you like to write an introduction? We'd love to have you do this.
Mhm.
And Chris says, fine, that would be okay. And they said to him, how much do you want? He said, enough to get me to London and back. And so they did, and so he did. And the piece In Memoriam Sherlock Holmes first ran in the Saturday Review and has still running today in, well, not Doubleday edition anymore. I don't think that's being published, but in other editions. And you can find it. It's probably the single essay about Sherlock Holmes that more people have read than anyone else, or at least seen. If they haven't read it, because lots of people don't read introductions. But
This is one that you all should find. You all should look this up if you have not read it, and read it, because it is a class. I mean, it is kind of the classic essay on Sherlock Holmes. I mean, it kicks off the collected, complete Sherlock Holmes, and it is kind of a masterpiece, I think. So.
And it's also really about Conan Doyle. I mean, because the first half is really an appreciation of Conan Doyle. So whenever you think that, Irregulars and the old Sherlockians just played the game, they never just played the game.
Right.
Even they would never say they just played the game. They always loved Conan Doyle, and they loved to see his place in the whole thing. And they gave him honors all the time.
Right. And it was just a sort of the actual idea that he was the literary agent can be taken far too seriously nowadays, because it never was taken that seriously by the BSI or the Irregulars. I mean, it's just kind of a joke, it's not real. We don't really think it. So,
although I had a friend just last night write to me and said, so is it true that because Sherlock Holmes's obit has never appeared in the Times that he's still alive?
Yes.
Yes, it is. At 167, he looks quite good.
He's holding up very well. He got his COVID shot, so he's good to go.
He got it before the Queen, because
yes,
he's older.
He's older, right? Yeah, exactly. Which is hard to believe, but it's true. So let's talk about one of my so there was the Grillparzer. I can never pronounce that.
The Franz Grillparzer Sittens Polizenverein, the Grillparzer Morals Police.
Right.
And so this was done because one of Morley's big tricks, and I do not have one of these at hand to show, was when he was meeting with friends and lunching with friends, was to mark the occasion by passing around a book, a random book, possibly, or the book that he was reading, or if they were passing a bookshop, something that was on the outside 5-cent shelf, and have everybody at it sign it. And so that time it was a copy of a Grillparzer, who was a 19th century German dramatist, plays, and so they all took to signing it. But this one stayed, and they kept using it, and they would sign it on every sort of meeting. And the Grillparzer Club had women in it as well, whereas the 3 Hours for Lunch Club really didn't, and certainly the Holmes part didn't, but Grillparzer did. And after a while, they started to develop their own rules and rituals, and one of them was starting to challenge each other for the cost of drinks over the content of the stories. So they might say, who's the most dangerous man in London? Or how many steps to Baker Street? Or any of these things. And if you didn't know, you had to buy that round of drinks. So they all started reading those stories because they were a thirsty lot. And
they drank back then, that's for sure.
And in this book, which is in a private collection today, they signed their names. They would inscribe little bits. They would underline passages and things like this. And so the book over time took on a life of its own. And it passed through various hands. from Chris, it went to Bill Hall, and from Bill Hall, it went to Julian Wolfe, and from Julian Wolfe, it went to its current owner. And
quite an artifact.
It's safe and happy in New York City.
That's good to know. Yeah, that's great. And so this club morphed into the Baker Street Irregulars. I mean, kind of, is my understanding correct? So we have this club, this meeting, starting to develop rituals and rules and that sort of thing, and customs, maybe that's a better word for it. And then suddenly, you're getting all this business going on in Saturday Review literature. It just seems like the cloud was kind of coalescing into something. And is that my understanding correct?
I think that's how it seems. It was in the air. I mean, Doyle was dead. People were thinking about it. There were the adaptations on the radio. Gillette was still, among the quick, and
right.
And it was a whole generation, we're going to say men here, of men who read these stories as boys. All of Chris's friends and contemporaries grew up reading Sherlock Holmes. I mean, first story's out in 1887, so Morley himself was born in 1890. So, Sherlock Holmes is what they read. And they were there, and they were reading them as young men and growing up, and as young marrieds and whatever. These were the stories that were still coming out till 1927. So this was only a couple years before. So they knew these stories, and they were in the big fancy magazines. They were
right. Yeah.
They were on the movie screens. They were everywhere.
It was sort of the cultural currency of the day. They were right there. Popular entertainment, pop culture, literature. It was all of that for them.
I think it would be sort of like somebody basing something on Friends or
right.
One of the any number of things. But and as we see, there are any number of clubs and activities. Popular culture is just that. So
kind of started in some ways right here with this. So let's talk about how we get to that first how they get to the point where they actually wanted to have a meeting, like a Baker Street Irregulars first meeting. Since they're already having lunch all the time, they're already kind of waving at each other in the magazine. How did they get from that to there?
Well, I think it sort of was that, a publicist came to Chris and said, look, you're doing all this stuff, and you've got an issue of, Saturday Review is coming out sometimes, all this sort of thing. So Morley's brother, his youngest brother, his Frank, worked as a publisher almost his entire career in England, and except during the war when he was back here. And Frank was bored on a sailing back to England, took a week. He'd read the books in the library or whatever. So he starts writing a crossword puzzle, designing a crossword puzzle. And he doesn't have a copy of the Sherlock Holmes stories at hand. So there are one or two things that are just a little off. But one or two things for a whole crossword puzzle, this is pretty good.
Pretty good.
To make a whole crossword puzzle without the source. So he likes it, he sends it on to his big brother. Chris publishes it, crediting his brother. Somehow along the way, various people lost Chris's name with that. I probably have that right here somewhere. Here we go. So a Sherlock Holmes crossword puzzle.
There it is. Hold it up a little higher. Okay, hold on. Nice. That is really good.
And we'll show you the puzzle itself. I suppose.
Wave of jealousy.
Oh, and the puzzle itself looks more or less like this. And
nice.
So So throwing that aside, and so he puts this in the paper. He says, look, anybody who does this and sends me a correct solution is a Baker Street irregular, because he's already been writing about the Baker Street irregulars. And they had one sort of cocktail meeting at the Hotel Duane in Midtown Manhattan, and so people send in solutions. Among them are women. They're all published and all get letters and things like this, but somehow the women never get invited when there's actually a formal dinner.
Do we know why? Because obviously
because they were all out of town. That's my thought. We are talking 1934, Steve. I think nobody figured that anybody was going to travel from, say, Santa Fe, which is where one of the group of women were who submitted a correct answer were, to New York City.
I know one of them was here from where I live in Indiana.
Yeah. So I think it was just sort of like, yeah, I said this. I don't really care. It's my club. I'm going to have people I know as members. I'm not really inviting people I don't know, because I don't really want to be in dinner with people I don't know. I'm doing that when I'm going out and giving lectures and doing book signings and things like this. I have to smile and be charming to the public. But here, it's pals. It's going to be a small group.
Right. I think Morley never anticipated that the group would be
300 people?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. I mean, it's true. He sort of thought it was going to stay, his little kind of clubby clique of like-minded pals who just had a thing, and that was, kind of fun. But something about it sparked the imagination of the, like, everybody. I mean, you get people writing about the Baker Street Irregulars in the newspapers and in magazine columns and gossip columns and like Bennett Cerf, he's writing stories and little gossipy pieces that he's including in his little collection of anecdotes. And he's got, and it's showing up. There's something about the idea of these kind of accomplished, literate men coming together to do this sort of childlike devotion to Sherlock Holmes, of all things.
Yeah,
and
I mean, Tony Boucher writes his mystery, The Case of the Baker Street Irregulars, all this sort of thing. It starts some sort of ball rolling. And meanwhile, then the movies are starting up again. And, by 1939, you've got the first Rathbone films, and he's on the radio, he's in the comic strips in the paper. It's everywhere.
Yeah, it's everywhere. So as the club got traction, we know that Morley at some point, kind of as it was growing and getting more organized, I think Edgar Smith had a lot to do with that, getting the club kind of formalized. He started to for a while he was disenchanted with it. I think that's fair to say.
I think what you have to consider a couple things. When he was at his period of highest disenchantment, it was larger, it was post-war. He was not in the best of health, though he hadn't had a real stroke. My theory, and it's my theory, I'm not a doctor, I don't play one on television, but based on reading his letters and looking at his letters, his composition changed, his way of writing changed, his way of typing changed, his handwriting changed. I think he had a couple of what we call now TIAs, mini strokes, and I think his personality was changing somewhat. He was tired. He had hoped to be able to do more sort of publicity things for the war effort during the war, and wasn't allowed to, during the war or after the war, go abroad and or things, because the government felt his health didn't warrant it even then, that his blood pressure was too high. He was a large man, and he was probably not up to it. So I think it was a lot of that. And then some of the people that were coming in, who were invited to this dinner by Edgar, more than Chris, because Chris said to Edgar, who he trusted entirely, you want to have the dinner? This is great. You may take care of all the details. I'll be there. I'll run the dinner. You collect the money and talk to the caterer and arrange the horrible bar bill, and I'll do the rest. And so he did, and he got not bored, I think, just irritated by some of these folks who were coming in. They were a little pushy. They were autograph collectors. They wanted him to sign stuff. He's thinking this is a social, a private social event. They're thinking it's
a thing.
Something else.
Yeah.
A thing, right? I don't know what, but a thing. And so this, got under his skin somewhat. And I think he just finally reached a point where one year, and what year was it? 49? Was it? 48, 49?
Right, toward the end of the 40s.
Right, where he just said to Edgar, look, we can have a dinner this year, but it can only be a small group. And there's a rather horrible letter where, he writes to somebody who became known as a very prominent Sherlockian and said, look, be a grown-up. We're sorry, we can't have you here. And it was a little rude. But he still thought of it as his group, and everyone else thought of it as his group as well. And by the next year, he changed his mind, and it survived being smaller for 1 year, but it probably wasn't the same for everybody. And
right.
And some of the people who were bothering him probably had too much to drink.
They did drink back then.
They did drink back then,
Some
and
of
they
those
were
bar tabs survive, and it's stunning what the
they were
per
there without
capita
their wives or
consumption.
family or anything else, and so they were just thinking, this is the era of the 3 martini lunches, and goodness knows by dinner time what you were doing. And so, but on the other end, it was a much smaller thing, whereas now we have a weekend that's almost a week, if not a month, of Sherlock Holmes.
Right.
Then it was dinner. I mean, towards the end of Chris's period, there was the Gillette luncheon, but that was it. Other than that, it was dinner. And that means these guys, who mostly worked in New York City, were coming in their suits from work because they weren't going home and they weren't putting on tuxedos. There were no tuxedos there other than the waiter. And they were just going straight from their office to wherever the dinner was. They were having endless more drinks, and then they were pouring themselves onto the train and going home.
And it was just kind of a bit of fun. It was like, this is where we go, and we're going to have a night of kind of sort of fun, and then it's over.
Right. There weren't investitures. There wasn't anything. A few papers were read. The toasts were given. There were probably challenges for the drinks because they had to pay for their drinks as they went along, and that was it. It was just a horseshoe-shaped table, and
it's amazing.
Started at one end and grew at the other.
I wonder, you do wonder what Morley would be thinking about how the organization has evolved over, 75 years or whatever, that, or more, that it is. But things evolve and grow organically. Nothing stays the same, and it's kind of a testimony to, in my opinion, it's a testimony to the how like we were saying, people found it fascinating, and they're always writing about this group of literary men meeting to celebrate Sherlock Holmes, and there's all these stories out there in the press and the gossip columns and that sort of thing. That's because people found it interesting, and they were attracted to it, and so. Same for us now. We are attracted to it. It's an interesting, fun, kind of whimsical hobby, and so it's quite understandable how it's grown over the many, many years that it's existed.
It is. I think he would be stunned that so many people were so interested and were willing to come from so many parts of the world. One time I was talking with his eldest daughter who lived in Edinburgh, and said to her something about, how had the dinner in January. And she said, in January? In New York? She said, "Are you daft?" And
Well,
I
Morley
said,
is the
"Yes."
one who, I mean, didn't it? I mean, he's the one who sort of picked the date, isn't he?
He is this one, but she didn't think that we were still doing it then. She figured we were all saner than her. It was one thing to pick the date when you were already in Midtown. You were already there. What's the
Right.
difference?
Let's go across town. That's,
Yeah. It's
another
another
to
thing to
fly in
say,
from.
Steve, come in from Indiana.
He's like, yeah, yeah. There's been, it's funny, and it was also his brother's birthday too, wasn't it? Frank's.
It's brother Felix's birthday. So yes, but
It's really great. Well, I mean, we're getting close to the end of our time. So, Steve, now correct me if I'm wrong. Are you working on a biography or something of Morley? I know that you have a tremendous Morley collection, and that you are, you're the
Ray
go.
Bessner says I am.
Well, Ray. I mean, if Ray said it, I mean, come on.
That's why I'm safe, right? So.
Well, I mean, there hasn't really been. I mean, I think there's been a book. Wasn't there 3
There
hours?
has been a book. It's not very good.
I don't think it was very good either. I've got it back.
And there's a lot of sources that are there, and now with the wonders of the internet and just things that have turned up over the last years. Yes, as you say, I do have a lot of things. I have probably over 1,000 letters of his and hundreds of manuscripts and pretty much everything that he wrote in all their various forms, which just shows what happens. You start buying books by somebody when you're 13 and you're still doing it when you're my age. You've got a long time to do it, and especially if nobody else cares about them, as they do about Morley, then it's an affordable hobby.
Wonderful, actually, I think. Well, we're just about out of time. So just one last question. What do you think, the Sherlockian universe has just grown, I mean, immensely from those days where they're meeting for lunch or they're getting together with 12 or 13, 20 guys, whatever, and, sitting around a table. I mean, obviously, like you said, it's an entire week. It's a week in New York, but it's every day in the world now. I mean, it is, right? I mean, it really is.
You and me, anyway. Yes.
Right. It never ends. So, what? And I know that many Sherlockians in the world, have come into the hobby, and for them, Morley is like ancient history. But does it pay for them? Would it pay for them to go back and sort of reacquaint themselves with the guy who kind of started it all?
I think so. I mean, for one thing, they could always, if they care about Sherlock Holmes, they could pick up a copy of this.
Yes.
Which, though out of print, is still easy enough to find. And that's pretty much all of Morley on Sherlock Holmes. But he's an excellent writer. His novels are good. No two of them are the same, and he grows in complexity as he goes along. He was among the best essayists of his time. I really do think so. And he's a wonderful letter writer, but there are no collections of letters, so you don't know that. You'll just have to take my word. But he's worth your attention. He's easy to find his books because there were so many of them and they went through so many editions, and their used copies are available cheaply. And
it's interesting that he gets more complex as he goes along, because I have found that to be true. I think, early was it Mysterious Bookshop, which is early, right? That's an early novel.
Haunted Bookshop is his second novel, yes. And
then,
right.
I'm trying to think of one right toward the end, because I've read a lot of them, and very different in style, I think. More mature.
Very different in style. His last novel was called The Man Who Made Friends with Himself, which is essentially about a guy sort of having a breakdown and fighting with his doppelganger, and it's about post-war suburbia and literature and publishing, and it's a book that I've read 3 or 4 times, and I'm still getting stuff out of it. He had hoped it would be sort of the great American novel. It isn't, but it's a very good book. His novel Kitty Foyle, the only one of his books to be filmed, is wonderful. It's a first-person account by a young woman, and Morley was not that young. He came out in 1939. A young woman from an Irish Catholic household who goes on, and she has this affair with this rich guy from the Philadelphia suburbs, and it's about New York, it's about Chicago, it's about Philadelphia. It's great, and it's a good movie that as true to the book as they could make it at that time, because it also has Kitty has an abortion in it, and you can't touch that. You even can only hint at the love affairs. But it's a.
He was writing about these adult themes in a quite honest way toward the end of his life, anyway.
Yeah, no, he got a letter from someone who wrote to him, someone who was a Quaker, writing, "Dear Christopher Morley, I wish thee had not written this book."
That's funny. That's great. Well, Steve, this has been great, and we're at the end of our time here. So
right.
I want to thank you for coming today. It's been wonderful. Yes, I want to remind everybody, this book, The Standard Doyle Company, it's edited by Steve Rothman, and it's all of it's all of Morley's written work about Sherlock Holmes, and it's great. It's really wonderful. So, sort of the one-stop shop. So, you can pick it up.
Thanks, Steve.
Highly recommended. Absolutely. Thank you. This has been fun. Always good to visit, Steve. Great.
Yeah.
So, thanks, and we'll.
Okay.
I do look forward to seeing you sooner than later in person. So,
one day
soon, I hope. Knock wood. Well, eventually. Okay, take care, my friend.
Thank you. Bye.
And that's it for this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch. I want to thank everybody who reached out to us over our hiatus. It's very much appreciated. In fact, in the last few weeks, we started getting a lot of inquiries about when is the show coming back and who are you having and that sort of thing. Well, we have a terrific, and I mean terrific, lineup of guests for the show this season. And I'm very excited about it. Next week, we're going to be talking to none other than David Stuart Davies, well-known Sherlockian from England, who is a favorite of many. David is an author and a Sherlockian film and television expert, and we will have a lot to talk about. In the meantime, I hope you all are safe and well, and I'm very grateful for the support. So, if you like the show, subscribe to our YouTube channel. And like us on Facebook when you see it appear, and all that good stuff. And in the meantime, I look forward to seeing you again here at the Fortnightly Dispatch.